Looking at the cake's like looking at the future. Until you've tasted it, what do you really know? And then, of course, it's too late. Too late.
Man is conditioned right from the beginning of his life that the world he lives in has an absolute material reality. So he grows up under the effect of this conditioning and builds his entire life on this viewpoint.
If you look at the very earliest cultures, some of whom are still extant upon the planet, the Aboriginal cultures, most of their languages only have one tense. Everything is subsumed within the present. They can talk about things that happened and things that haven't happened yet but will happen in the future, but they talk about them in the present tense. Now, it seems that not only have we split up our existence, our study of existence, into all of these different areas, but we've also subdivided our notion of time into different zones. Whereas once there was this great eternal present, which I assume to be the kind of constant now that animals exist in, for example. But we, as conscious individuals, have, as a species, adapted this different notion of time, where we almost see time as a bead on a wire, that the now is just this constantly moving tiny little moment that we're all in, that is sliding inexorably along a wire from past to future.
Grail stretched his hand out toward the cabinet beside him and fumbled for a large sheet of paper that was lying upon it. Brailden watched him in silence, and the old man continued. How often we have all heard arguments about the size of the universe and whether it has any boundaries. We can imagine no ending to space, yet our minds rebel at the idea of infinity. Some philosophers have imagined that space is limited by curvature in a higher dimension. I suppose you know the theory. It may be true of other universes if they exist, but for ours, the answer is more subtle. Along the line of the wall, Brailden, our universe comes to an end, and yet does not. There was no boundary, nothing to stop one going onward before the wall was built. The wall itself is merely a man-made barrier, sharing the properties of the space in which it lies. Those properties were always there, and the wall added nothing to them. He held the sheet of paper toward Brailden and slowly rotated it. Here, he said, is a plain sheet. It has, of course, two sides. Can you imagine one that has not? Brailden stared at him in amazement. That's impossible, ridiculous. But is it? Said Grail softly. He reached toward the cabinet again, and his fingers groped in its recesses. Then he drew out a long, flexible strip of paper, and turned vacant eyes to the silently waiting Brailden. We cannot match the intellects of the first dynasty, but what their minds could grasp directly, we can approach by analogy. This simple truth, which seems so trivial, may help you to glimpse the truth. He ran his fingers along the paper strip, then joined the two ends together to make a circular loop. Here I have a shape which is perfectly familiar to you, the section of a cylinder. I run my finger around the inside, so, and now along the outside. The two surfaces are quite distinct. You can go from one to the other only by moving through the thickness of the strip. Do you agree? Well, of course, said Brailden, still puzzled, but what does it prove? nothing," said Grail. "But now watch." This sun, Shervain thought, was Trilorn's identical twin. The darkness had now lifted completely, and there was no longer the sensation, which he would not try to understand, of walking across an infinite plain. He was moving slowly now, for he had no desire to come too suddenly upon that vertiginous precipice. In a little while he could see a distant horizon of low hills, as bare and lifeless as those he had left behind him. This did not disappoint him unduly, for the first glimpse of his own land would be no more attractive than this. So he walked on. And when presently an icy hand fastened itself upon his heart, he did not pause as a man of lesser courage would have done. Without flinching, he watched that shockingly familiar landscape rise around him, until he could see the plain from which his journey had started, and the great stairway itself, and at last Brailden's anxious, waiting face. Again Grail brought the two ends of the strip together, but now he had given it a half-twist, so that the band was kinked. He held it out to Brailden. "Run your finger around it now," he said quietly. Brailden did not do so. He could see the old man's meaning. "I understand," he said. "You no longer have two separate surfaces. It now forms a single continuous sheet, a one-sided surface, something that at first sight seems utterly impossible." "Yes," replied Grail very softly. "I thought you would understand. A one-sided surface. Perhaps you realize now why this symbol of the twisted loop is so common in the ancient religions, though its meaning has been completely lost. Of course, it is no more than a crude and simple analogy, an example in 2 dimensions of what must really occur in 3. But it is as near as our minds can ever get to the truth."
If you look at some of the models that people like Stephen Hawking have suggested for time, then you find something which is actually much closer to that primitive apprehension of how time is structured than to our rather simplistic and fatalistic idea of past, present and future. I believe that Hawking talks about space-time as a kind of a gigantic starry football, a rugby ball, if you like. And at one end of it, you have the Big Bang. And at the other end of it, everything comes together again in a big crunch. But that the whole football exists all the time. That there is this gigantic hyper moment in which everything is occurring. That would mean that it was only our conscious minds that were ordering things into past, present and future.
What is the will that sees, hears, and perceives all other senses if it is not the brain? Who is it that sees, hears, touches, and perceives the taste and smell? Who is this being that thinks, reasons, has feelings, and moreover that says, "I am me"? One of the important thinkers of our age, Karl Pribram, also poses the same question. Since the Greeks, philosophers have been thinking about the ghost in the machine, the small man within the small man, etc. Where is I, the person who uses his brain? Who is it that realizes the act of knowing? As St. Francis of Assisi said, what we search for is the one that sees. In fact, this metaphysical being that uses the brain, that sees and feels is the soul. What we call the material world is the aggregate of perceptions viewed and felt by this soul. Just as the bodies we possess and the material world we see in our dreams have no physical reality, the universe we occupy and the bodies we possess now also have no physical reality. The real absolute being is the soul. Matter consists merely of perceptions viewed by the soul. Yes, even if we start with the presupposition that matter is real, the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology all lead us to the fact that matter consists of an illusion and to the inevitable actuality of a metaphysical matter. This is the secret beyond matter.